discuss today. I'm honored to have the Prime Minister of Estonia, Mr. Taavi Rõivas, and the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, NATO forces, General Phillip Breedlove. Today we're discussing the crisis of Ukraine and its implications. As many of you know, the crisis is an inflection point in transatlantic security, and the crisis, particularly with the summit, will address many of the issues that are facing the alliance and that have been issues that have been there before the crisis occurred. But really the summit in Wales in 2014 will be defined by the decisions that the alliance makes that have implications for both Ukraine but also wider alliance security. This panel in particular is about Ukraine, but the implications are beyond Ukraine and actually beyond Russia. There's a dynamic security environment that's ongoing in Europe, and Ukraine really just serves as a real-world example of some of the issues that the transatlantic alliance is looking at to enhance its security and deal with the challenges that we're facing, and how to rethink, relook, respond, rebuild, and reassure an alliance so it again succeeds for another 65 years in strengthening the transatlantic bond. I would say Ukraine has exposed fundamental challenges in the alliance, but also it provides a rallying point for 28 members to come together at Wales to discuss real issues and how to strengthen a transatlantic bond. There's been some serious challenges to European stability, and some serious flaws have been exposed as a result of this crisis. One is that Europe itself was safe from aggression. That was an assumption that we had over the last few years. Second is the inviolability of borders in Europe has been exposed. And finally, the view of Russia as a constructive partner in Euro-Atlantic security has been questioned. NATO now is dealing with some short-term responses to these challenges, which hopefully will have long-term development. One, it's restoring its primary task of collective defense. Two, supporting Ukraine and partners. And three, raising costs to Russia, both through military freezing in relations but also sanctions. One of the things that I hope our panelists focus on is some of the longer-term challenges to NATO. Is again on burden sharing and the 2% threshold. We're going to see a statement, we believe, coming out of the summit. But second, something that we may not see which is a collective Russia policy on how we approach Russia as a result of this crisis and some of the documents that we've signed with Russia, including the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Finally, the partnership and enlargement. How do we approach the challenge not only of reassuring allies, but how to reassure partners on Europe's east that are still looking to NATO as a source of security and are looking to actually integrate in the alliance. Again, I'm joined by two people that I feel really embody what all of us here believe in terms of principles and values. We have a young emerging leader, frankly, the youngest leader in Europe, His Honorable Taavi Rõivas. He's served as the Prime Minister since March of 2014. Prior to this, he was the Minister of Social Affairs in Estonia for 2 years. And actually was also a mayor of the Habersti locality and has served as an advisor to the Prime Minister as well. And frankly, is someone that we are looking to be a leader for many years to come on European security. We also have General Phillip Breedlove. I'll be frank when I say the Supreme Allied Commander and the head of U.S. European Command has been our MVP, our most valuable player in Washington, on someone who's been a leader in proactively calling it like it is on the crisis in Ukraine. He has been very proactive in providing clarity and purpose to the alliance and also describing Russian aggression very clearly and with strength and leadership, and has been a real advocate and a leader in policy development on the Ukraine crisis. He assumed his duties as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in May of 2013, has huge operational experience, 3,500 hours flying F-16s all over the globe, and with operational assignments in Korea, Italy, as well as the United States. He was head of the 3rd Air Force at Ramstein, as well as commander of U.S. forces in Europe. Without any further ado, I welcome the Prime Minister to open the remarks.
Thank you, Mark, for your kind introduction. And it's really an honor and a good opportunity to be here and address you. Chairman Breedlove, ladies and gentlemen, you were very right to say that this summit here in Wales is about strengthening the collective defense of the alliance and the transatlantic bond. And since the end of Cold War, NATO has evolved from an alliance that is only concerned with territorial defense to one that has been a force of good in crisis management around the world and has contributed significantly to building defense capacity with its numerous partners across the globe. And for the last 20 years, NATO's efforts have centered on operations that have been often very far from our own borders. But Russia's actions in and around Ukraine over the last 6 months have swung the focus of NATO's attention firmly back to its roots. In the next 2 days here in Wales, the alliance will demonstrate that it is ready, able to respond, and has the collective will to defend allies against any threat. Russia's actions against in and around Ukraine, as well as its aggressive military posture right on the borders of our alliance, are definitely a very powerful wake-up call, and this is something that we do have to take very seriously. And the events of the last 6 months have reassured a dynamic in our security thinking that we had all assumed and hoped would no longer apply in a post-Cold War Europe. As the illusion of the end of history was shattered on the September 11th, 2001, so has been the presumption that war within Europe belongs to the trash bin of history. Today, Russia is engaged in an undeclared war, I would say, with a neighbor, part of whose territory it has already illegally annexed. Russian troops are occupying areas of 3 nearby states, also Moldova and Georgia, in addition to Ukraine, and against, of course, the country's explicit wishes. Russia has placed NATO and the European Union at the center of its threat perception. Internally, democracy is all but non-existent, and the country is rapidly moving towards dictatorship. And in its actions in Ukraine, Russia has shown complete contempt for international law, agreements, and norms. And it has embraced a series of policies that pose a direct military threat not just to Ukraine or other immediate neighbors, but also to entire Euro-Atlantic security, I would say. And it's implementing those policies continuously through its aggressive posture towards NATO allies. And most worrying of us is the speed in which Russia has demonstrated through SNAP exercises that it's able to concentrate forces at a place of its choosing. Furthermore, Russia continues to demonstrate the ruthless pursuit of information dominance through its relentless misleading information campaign. And we should not forget that Russia bears the responsibility for the shooting down of MH17 with the loss of almost 300 innocent lives on board. For some allies, all this might seem too far and of no direct concern, but for those of us in the front line, it's a matter of grave and immediate concern. Our populations remember the days of Soviet occupation and living with a brutal dictatorship. They have chosen the path of freedom and are determined that it will not undone by resurgent Russia. While the security situation we find ourselves in today should not be labeled as Cold War, and we should continue to seek a diplomatic solution to the current crisis, we should all be aware that Mr. Putin's Russia will continue on its current course. And unless and until it perceives that the free nations of Europe, supported by our transatlantic allies, US, Canada, have the hard power and the heart will stand up for it. So the current security environment will be with us for a longer time to come. Over the last quarter of a century, my country, Estonia, has moved forward with the utter confidence that European democracies are entitled to choose their own destiny. With a population of 1.3 million people in a thin, flat strip of land, we remain confident that the bloody methods of power politics will never again jeopardize our democracy and the free choices of our people. But through these years, Estonian security policy thinking has been guided by Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, the founding act of NATO, that in order to be effective, the allies will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist an armed attack. Our defense is developed on two interrelated pillars. On one side, we build on our strong relations with our allies and the credibility of NATO's collective defense. On the other side, we strengthen our own defense through the whole of the society. In Estonia, I would say most of the state institutions have defense-related tasks, and we continue to have conscription, which is supported by the vast majority of the population, 92% even. Such an approach ensures the sustainability of Estonia in all possible scenarios. And in all this, we know that security has a price and does not come for free. Despite the challenging times in economies, Estonia continues to invest 2% of our GDP in defense and our deployable forces around the world. To us, it's only fair that if we are to expect others to come to our aid, should it be required, we must meet the guidelines that we all collectively as an alliance have established. And the 2% of GDP to be dedicated to defense is a guideline which we are determined to abide by. In response to the concerns expressed by Estonia and our frontline neighbors, the alliance has taken a number of immediate steps to react to Russia's aggression in our neighborhood, to which all 28 allies are contributing. And of course, it comes by no surprise that this new approach, as Secretary General has eloquently called the Readiness Action Plan, was developed during the Council's visit to Tallinn in May. This demonstrates a clear collective will and solidarity, and most importantly, the cohesion of the alliance in the face of a clear security threat. Ladies and gentlemen, more planes in the air, more ships at the sea, and more troops on the ground in the east of Alliance territory are what we are already achieving, and this is now the new normal. NATO's uniqueness, in addition to its integrated military structures and its permanent political decision-making mechanism, is its ability and willingness to adapt into a new security realm. NATO's new posture must be sustained and reinforced, if necessary, for as long as required. And that is what NATO is adapting to be able to do so. In the longer run, NATO must have the 3 Ps: presence, pre-positioning, and planning in place in the Eastern Territory. And this must be backed by forces that are ready to be able to respond rapidly when needed. And of course, this is in light of Russia's ability to concentrate force quickly. Here in Wales, we will establish the groundwork for the adoption of the alliance to meet the new security environment in Europe. And while the immediate challenge is in the East and has been the catalyst of adoption, we in Estonia fully understand that problems may also arise in the south of the alliance and from other directions. And that is why our adopted alliance must be able to tackle all the challenges it might face, and Estonia will play its part in preparing to do so. The difference between the Cold War days and the world we live in now is one where never threats are an ever-emerging reality, and traditional ones have not entirely disappeared. We must be able to tackle them all. But above all, we must be able and prepared for the overriding responsibility of being an ally in NATO, responding under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty to an attack on one as an attack on all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. General.
Mr. Prime Minister, colleagues, thanks for allowing me to be here today. I'll try to be brief because I really want to get to your questions, and it is an important time. After my first year as the SAC-Europe, it's clear to me that we're entering a phase of strategic and operational adaptation. Adaptation shaped by the end of ISAF and the rapidly changing global security environment of the past few months, due and highlighted by the continuing actions of the Russian Federation. The Washington Treaty that created NATO in 1949 was driven by a common interest. World War II was over and a new common threat had emerged, which united our efforts on both sides of the Atlantic and forged a common alliance. As we came to the end of the Cold War, the 1990s were a period of great challenge, adaptation, and opportunity. This was matched by a robust creative period of NATO military and policy development that led to initiatives such as the Combined Joint Task Force, Partnership for Peace, and the initial moves towards crisis management and our first out-of-area operations. We are now again facing decisive, strategic, and operational challenges, and the new period of adaptation will require the same level of innovation, robust ideas, and creative redesign of the military posture to set the alliance on a stable foundation and a trajectory for the future that we see. If there's any doubt of the relevance of NATO before now, the last few months have cleared that up and reinforced the need for our essential core tasks. Russia's actions represent a clear decision by Moscow to not adhere to the baseline assumptions and principles that have shaped Europe's security for the past 25 years. Both Russia's overt and covert involvement in Ukraine has been carefully planned and considered. Today, Russian regular forces, irregular forces, special forces, Russian-backed forces, and Russian financing are very, very active in eastern Ukraine. Russia initially supported its destabilizing activity within the eastern regions of Ukraine by massing huge military forces on the borders. These forces had two purposes. First, they could respond quickly to reinforce any foothold that was established inside of Ukraine. But second, this very large force and this very capable force could invade if required or sit coercively to moderate Kiev's response to their Russian forces, special forces, and backed forces inside of the country. Russia has used ambiguity to mask their action. We must, in every case, eliminate this ambiguity and refute the false narrative. Additionally, we must be clear about what has taken place and be able to identify this sort of activity if it continues to happen beyond the Ukrainian crisis, and particularly if it should occur inside of NATO's borders. The Russian military action, taken collectively as a new military model for the application of military force to achieve political aims. This is a well-developed model in the Russian military thinking, and one the alliance must understand and must address. The Russians have demonstrated a new flexibility in moving their forces significant distances, achieving readiness very rapidly and maneuvering their forces and positioning them for a variety of possible options. This flexibility, agility, and speed at the strategic and operational level is a major characteristic of the Russian military campaign inside Ukraine thus far, and one of the Russians that they have used very much to their advantage. Unbadged forces, large-scale Russian military developments, snap exercises, concealing preparations for military conflict, informal warfare, cyber, and other unconventional actions represent a significant broadening of the tools used by the Russian military. We are observing Russian forces fighting alongside separatists inside Ukraine. Russian air defense assets are being used to conceal the advance of Russian tactical units throughout eastern Ukraine, and still, Moscow is continuing to deny any direct involvement across the border, despite the casualties and deaths that are amounting of their own soldiers. As we adapt our forces, structures, and methods for the future, we must be clear about what we feel are the challenges and the threats that face our alliance. We need to clearly articulate our role in deterrence and then, if required, our role in defense. We must be ready to respond appropriately to protect and assure all alliance members if we are to maintain our credibility. It's time to ask ourselves some very hard questions. Is the alliance agile and flexible enough to respond appropriately? Do our exercises and readiness measures allow us to adequately respond to the destabilizing practice of Russian snap exercise witnessed over the last years? Are our forces responsive enough and positioned correctly to address the current strategic challenge? Are we structured correctly to provide a rapid and credible response? The crisis in Ukraine has highlighted that our current approach to readiness does not necessarily translate into responsiveness. We will need to evolve certain aspects of the alliance in order to become more adaptive and responsive to future challenges. We need to examine the feasibility of standing forces and command and control structures that are permanently established and up to speed before the next crisis puts them to the test. And we need to make sure that we have a balanced force, a capability that includes all aspects of air, land, and sea. Our immediate assurance measures, for example, sending additional aircraft to enhance the air policing over the Baltic states, contributes to the alliance's coherent strategic approach to reassurance and deterrence. And they reinforce existing alliance crisis management measures. The measures are meaningful, incremental, and flexible with strategic depth, breadth, and clear purpose. And most importantly, they are proportional to the general threat that we see. The sustainability of the assurance measures over the next several months is fundamental to maintaining the strategic effect for the alliance. We can be certain that our assurance measures will not go unchallenged by Russia. We can expect reaction and countermeasures intended to reduce the effect of our actions and to apply pressure to the cohesion of our alliance as the Russians seek to continue their doctrinal approach of escalation dominance. And let's not forget, Russian actions are not the only concern of our alliance. The activity in Iraq and Syria by the organization calling themselves the Islamic State represents one of the biggest threats we see now. We also need to consider threats from our southern flank, continuing our Patriot deployments in Turkey, ongoing operations in Afghanistan and Kosovo, cybersecurity challenges, and other potential actions that will draw our attention. NATO must be able to do multiple things simultaneously, and this must also be a factor for our planning into the future. Thanks for bearing with my remarks. I look forward to your questions.
So, Prime Minister, you're coming off of a historic visit from President Obama, also a long 10 years of Estonia's membership into NATO. Did you receive the assurances that you would hope for? And also, did you get some flavor on what the reassurance assistance plan will actually mean for Estonia and mean for alliance security in particular?
Well, of course, when the President of the United States comes to Tallinn and says that you will never again lose your independence, that we are here for you, that protecting Tallinn, Riga, or Vilnius is as important as protecting Berlin, Paris, or London. These are very, very strong signals and are appreciated a lot by the Estonians. We discussed the current deployment that the United States has already done, and we are very thankful for that, what NATO has done already. And we discussed also the potential next steps in order to be prepared and to have enough deterrence in place that nobody even thinks of testing Article 5's credibility. And as I said, we believe that the actual things to have in place, what we need are 3 Ps. First of all, presence, so that it's visibly seen that Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, they are not alone, but there is allied presence. Secondly, pre-positioning in order to really credibly be able to react to the very, very fast action from potential aggressors. And the third is to just to revise the plans and to make them cope with the current security situation.
Right. General Breedlove, there has been obviously great reassurance, and I misspoke in the readiness action plan, but there's also steps that the U.S. and NATO have taken to reassure partners. As you know, also there's questions about how do we move forward with helping Ukraine. One of those questions is about providing equipment, particularly lethal equipment. Can you address some of the things that you would like to see that would help not only reassure allies, but reassure real partners that are undergoing huge security threats from Russia?
So there is a lot of good news here. The immediate reaction of the nations, all 28, contributing to our assurance measures that are ongoing now, was heartwarming, quite frankly. Our alliance really showed its solidarity and its steadfastness in the way that we were able to quickly get reassurance measures into not only the north, but the center and the south. And this has to be sustained. I'm tasked, my headquarters now is tasked, of course, to do that through the end of this year. We expect that during this conference, we will be tasked to continue those assurance measures until we get through to the accomplishment of the adaptation that will be called for by the RAP. I like to talk about that in terms of the first paper we wrote when we began this discussion, and I call it the three-legged stool. The first leg of that stool is that we would have a more responsive NRF. The NRF right now does exactly what we ask it to do. It does it incredibly well, and we evaluate it, and it passes those evaluations. But in the face of what Russia has put on the table, it is inadequate to the new task. And so now the first leg of our three-legged stool is that we have to adapt that NRF to be more responsive, more capable to meet what we see in these Russian exercises and capabilities. The second is, as you heard in several of the remarks, for over 12 years we have been treating Russia like a partner. We've been trying to bring them closer to the Western nations. And in doing so, we have essentially adapted along the time what we thought was required as far as Article 5 defense and command and control. So the second leg of the stool is that we need a headquarters in the forward area that is tasked 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, with being ready for and thinking about Article 5 collective defense. So first leg was a more responsive NRF. Second leg is a command and control structure in the forward area that is capable of planning and being ready for Article 5 every day, all day. And then the third leg of the stool is this forward presence that you heard the Prime Minister talk about in his 3 Ps. And that is creating an entity in these forward nations that on a routine basis prepares and exercises with our fellow forces and it is setting the stage so that if we need to, we can rapidly respond with much larger and more capable forces if we see an act of aggression. And so establishing these forward headquarters, pre-positioning of equipment, establishing the method to get our forces in and out quickly and rapidly assimilate serious combat power That's what we need. So 3 legs of the stool, none of them work without the others. A 3-legged stool, you pull one leg out, it falls over. Rapidly reacting forces, command and control forward, and then a forward presence that enables and allows rapid reinforcement, and on a day-to-day basis is a platform for training, assurance, and deterrence.
Thanks.
That's what we need to focus on.
Appreciate it. Questions from the group? Please.
To what extent has Russia contributed to individual political contributions financially amongst your citizens? Is that a problem? And if so, what are you doing about it?
Maybe Ben, 1 or 2 more questions. Go ahead.
General Breedlove, in your introduction, you said that planning and being ready for an action is important. I want to twist that and ask you a question. Is like, for military operations, what we see is we see a pre-crisis and during crisis and a post-crisis situation for NATO, how to handle the crisis situations. And when I look at it, during crisis, we know the crisis management and security, and post-crisis, we know development, restructure, and reframing the society. But for the pre-crisis situation, my question is how to handle a crisis, like not to happen, not to take place at the first sight, which actually is just like a twist of what you said. We need to be ready for an action. So I would like to ask that question. Thank you.
More, if we can, right here.
Hi, Patrick Muldrow from the Estonian Foreign Ministry. In the conflict in Georgia in 2008, we can comfortably say that the Western world went back to business as usual relatively quickly. And I would say that this is something that we are definitely looking to avoid with the crisis in Ukraine. Of course, they're completely different conflicts, but is it possible that it may be time to reconsider the NATO-Russia Founding Act, given the blatant violations of this document by Russia in Ukraine? And is it perhaps a serious disadvantage for us to play by a set of rules that Russia is clearly disregarding? Thank you.
Great. So we've got one on Russia financial, one on deterrence and avoiding conflict, and a third question on not ensuring we don't go back to business as usual, particularly with the Russian Founding Act.
Let me address the pre, during, and post, and how do we avoid crisis. It's an excellent question, and I look at it in 2 ways. 2 things are very important to me, and one of them is extremely important to me for the 3 Baltic nations. So the first thing to avoid crisis is to be ready for crisis and make sure that everyone understands you're ready for it. In other words, if you cause a crisis, you will face us and we are ready. So we need to be very clear in our organization and the way we prepare, that the world sees what our leaders are now saying every day, that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. We need to show the strength and capability to do that. So that's number 1. The second one is a little bit more nuanced, and I think it has direct application in the 3 Baltic nations. And that is that what we see in Russia now in this new hybrid approach to war is to use all of the tools that they have to include their military. But let's not forget all the other tools to reach into a nation and cause instability, use their energy tools, use their finance tools, use what I think is probably the most amazing information warfare blitzkrieg we have ever seen in the history of information warfare, using all these tools to stir up problems that they can then begin to exploit with their military tool through coercion, like we talked about, large forces on the border, or through what we see now in Crimea, what we've seen in eastern Ukraine, Russian regular and irregular forces, little green men without badges inside of nations stirring trouble. So I think that one of the things, and we've been talking with our Baltic brothers, is that we need to look at our pre-crisis ability to handle this hybrid warfare. How do we build capacity in Ministry of Interior Forces? How do we build capacity in justice? How do we build capacity in policing? And then also in the military to address this hybrid warfare in a nation when Russia kicks it off. We had a series of meetings in the NAC that I think were very telling, and that is we talked about when you cannot attribute, this causes problems. But the moment that we attribute these actions to an aggressor nation, now this is Article 5. So we need to build the nation's ability to fight through that first onslaught, attribute to an aggressor nation, and then NATO Article 5 kicks in.
Yeah. There was a question about Russian economic influence. In our country, it's not bigger than in Europe as a whole. Our country is very much also partly thanks to Russia opposing double tariffs already in the early 90s. Our country took a very clear economic path towards Europe, and thus our economy is very much linked to European Union. But less than 10% of our trade is with Russia, like 8 to 9%, so not comparable with the trade of EU. But what is Russian economic influence? The main importance is that there is a strong gas dependence in many European countries, I would say Europe as a whole. And whenever you are dependent on a single source of energy, this causes you problems. And when you're dependent on a supplier that's not always friendly or who has a track record of using this gas supply as a weapon even, I would say, not unconventional weapon definitely, but a weapon to change politics, this is not a good dependence to have. One of the topics we discussed with President Obama yesterday, and what I have discussed with many senators and congressmen, is that the game changer in this issue would be a lot more trade energy-wise with the US and in the EU. And this doesn't apply only for our region. I would say some of the Central and Western European countries are far more dependent even, because they use simply gas as a higher part of their energy supply. Now the question about a pattern developing, Russia intervening in its neighbors' business in Georgia, in Ukraine, and so on, and whether the security situation is the same as it used to be in '97 when the Founding Act said that under the current security circumstances and so on. I would say the security situation is not the same. I think this is rather clear. Well, it's a matter of discussion whether there is a need to publicly denounce the act. I'm not sure if this is the right approach, but I think not mentioning it and not limiting our own actions with it would be a perfectly right way to do. There's no issue at all, or no question at all, that Russia has not followed the act. Clearly not. Of course, even if we say that we are very polite and we are setting ourselves some limitations, well, we have to remind that this act does not exclude the use of Article 5. This act does not exclude us from reinforcing our borders. So we can do a lot, even if we do not denounce this act. But of course, the discussions of whether this is still actual are in place, and I would be happy to discuss that with my colleagues. I think that security situation has changed.
Sorry. If I could just pile on that, because I share the opinion. Everything that we're doing in the RAP conforms to the NATO-Russia Founding Act. I'm not concerned about the actions that we're proposing. They fall well within the scope and intent of that act. They prepare us to take much more drastic and needed actions if required. But the actions that we're proposing for forward presence and capability do not fall outside of the Act. It would be my opinion, and I would just offer my opinion only, that we should not abrogate the Act. Clearly, Russia has, but we could take the moral high ground and remain within the Act, and I think affect the changes that we need to in Russia and move forward without abrogating, or in our alliance, and move forward without abrogating the Act.
Thank you. That's an important view. We have about 8 minutes, one more batch of questions, please.
General Breedlove, thank you very much. My name is Vasyl Marchenko. I'm from Ukraine. Thank you very much for your strong statement on Russia. You mentioned that NATO will work on enhancing military capabilities of Ukraine. I would like to see more, if you have any concrete information about a possibility of actually sending arms and weapons to Ukraine. And secondly, can NATO prevent other NATO member countries from supplying military equipment to Russia, especially with respect to the French warships Mistral? Would NATO consider purchasing those warships from France? Thank you.
In the back.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Nuger from Bloomberg News. A question first for the Prime Minister. You said that Russia has placed NATO and the EU at the center of its threat perception. Could you tell us what your threat perception is, especially vis-à-vis Russia? And if I might ask General Breedlove, in the wake of Mr. Putin's announcement of efforts to start a ceasefire, can you give us your assessment of the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine today? Is there any evidence of a Russian disengagement? How many Russian troops are still there? And how long would it take them to pull back if indeed they chose to do so?
And one more question, Kelly.
Thank you. Michaela Dodge at Heritage. Over the past several years, we've been through several rounds of discussions about impacts of sequestration on U.S. defense budget. General Breedlove, could you maybe talk about, when you think long term, how does budget uncertainty impact your ability to prioritize, plan, and build relationships with allies? Thank you.
Great, last set of questions. So we've got one on Ukraine arms, threat perception, the ceasefire on the ground, and budget and sequester, the reality of resources, Chris.
Okay, I can start with the threat perception. Well, the facts on the ground are that Russia is an aggressor in its neighboring country. This is a fact, and I think none of us questions that. Purely a fact that there is a country in Europe that thinks that borders can be changed by force in the 21st century, this is of course a threat, no question. If it's a direct military threat to NATO allies, I would say no. I'm certain in NATO, in Article 5, we do know that attacking every single part of NATO and NATO not reacting would be the end of NATO and would be the end of the credibility of NATO for good. So there is no logic in anyone to attack any NATO country, but also because of the different kinds of warfare, just like General Breedlove mentioned, we need some deterrence and some clear visibility that NATO takes all its areas seriously. And this also means that, at least publicly, we should not always refer to the limitations, self-set limitations that are in this 97 signed act that we keep somewhat away from our borders or something like that. We should not let anyone think that we are hesitating when it is needed to be present. This doesn't mean that we necessarily have to publicly denounce it, as I said, but we don't have to constantly refer to it. And the second question, yeah, well, I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you,
They
sir.
were addressed to you, Martin.
So to the question of what NATO can do as far as enhancing Ukraine, what it is doing, et cetera, I do not want to preclude the prerogative of our leaders who will talk about some of those things here. Clearly, many of the nations already are doing bilateral things. My nation in my U.S. hat is clearly doing a lot of things bilaterally. NATO itself, as you know, is taking actions and are going to talk about more actions here. Again, I'd rather not preclude what I will retain my job longer if I don't preclude the prerogative of our leaders, but clearly they have the capability. As far as your question about can NATO stop a nation from selling things to the Russian, no, it can't. This is an alliance where we come to agreement, and we don't force our will on any one of the 28. Clearly, nations can encourage. Clearly, NATO can look at options that might help to avert. There are a lot of things that NATO can do, but what it doesn't do is direct the actions of a sovereign nation. That's not what we'll do. And so that will be worked on by the larger alliance. To the question about the ceasefire, I don't see a lot of credibility in what Mr. Putin has put on the table. Remember, one of the first things Mr. Putin said is Russia cannot negotiate as a part of the ceasefire because Russia's not involved in this conflict. It's laughable, so that's not quite right. What I would say is what many have said through the course of history when it comes to military actions, and that is that actions speak a lot more than words. A proposal for a ceasefire when literally 3 offensive advances of Russian troops inside Ukraine continue, I think they ring hollow. And so I would say that actions, meaning Russian disengagement inside of Ukraine and pulling back the Russian troops that are in Ukraine, now that begins to show actions that would maybe facilitate a ceasefire. And I remain and have been very vocal that a ceasefire inside of Ukraine first has to start with the closure of the border. Any ceasefire without closure of the border benefits Russian actions inside of Ukraine because Russian movement, Russian forces, Russian equipment, Russian money will continue to pour in if the border doesn't close. A ceasefire facilitates reinforcement of eastern Ukraine unless the border is closed. And so those would be the actions that would be required. To the question, more of a U.S. question about sequester and budget uncertainty. Clearly, sequester will cause concern for all of U.S. engagement overseas because the entire U.S. budget is under pressure by sequester, and overseas presence comes under pressure first when military forces face budget constraints. And so the uncertainty and the pressure of budget downsizing as it relates to sequester will remain problematic for American commanders overseas into the future.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think clearly we've laid out what are a lot of our aspirations for some of the concrete steps that are going to be both at the summit, but also for the alliance as a result of the implications of Ukraine. I want to thank both of you for your leadership. We have the challenge, which I know you've worked a lot on, is not only finding solutions, but also trying to determine how we can get the public and Parliament to back the decisions that political leaders have made. And for us, that is one of our core tasks, is understanding how to avoid growing isolation in our nations, to really get the public support to sustain some of these decisions to strengthen the transatlantic bond. We really appreciate your help with it, and you've served as an example for all of us. So I appreciate your time and all your questions for the crisis.
Thank you.